There's a person sitting in a parking lot right now, engine off, practicing clutch engagement with no destination in mind. They are not learning. They already know how to drive. They are doing it because something about the motion, foot down, gear selected, foot up slowly, feels like the only thing in the world they can fully control. That behavior looks eccentric from the outside. From the inside, it feels necessary. Manual transmission obsession among millennials is not about cars. It never was. It is about a generation that came of age during a period of profound instability, reached for something mechanical and honest, and never let go. To understand why, you have to go back, not to the millennials' childhood, but to the decades that built the cultural DNA they absorbed before they could drive. The 1960s and 1970s produced the mythology. The Ford Mustang debuted in 1964 and sold over 1 million units in its first 2 years. It was not just a car, it was a statement that ordinary people could access something that felt extraordinary. Steve McQueen drove a 1968 Mustang Fastback through the hills of San Francisco in Bullitt, and every gear change was filmed with the reverence typically reserved for violence or prayer. The clutch, the heel-toe downshift, the mechanical negotiation between driver and machine, cinema made these things sacred. A generation of parents absorbed that mythology. Their children inherited it without knowing its source. By the 1980s, the cultural signal shifted slightly. The manual transmission became a marker of the serious driver. Ayrton Senna won 3 Formula One championships between 1988 and 1991. Footage of his hands working the wheel and the gear lever in Monaco, threading through tunnels, correcting slides with surgical precision, circulated as something closer to art than sport. These images embedded themselves into popular consciousness. Driving with full physical engagement became associated with intelligence, mastery, and control. The automatic transmission, by contrast, began to carry a subtle cultural stigma. It was for people who were not paying attention. That stigma mattered more than anyone acknowledged. Children growing up in the late 1980s and 1990s absorbed the idea that knowing how to drive a manual car was a form of competence. It separated people who understood machines from people who merely used them. When those children became teenagers in the early 2000s, learning to drive stick was not just practical, it was initiation. Then, the world shifted. The 2008 financial crisis arrived when the oldest millennials were in their mid-20s. The economy they had been promised did not exist. Degrees that were supposed to guarantee stability delivered debt instead. Housing became inaccessible. Careers felt fragile and non-linear. The psychological literature on this period is consistent. Chronic unpredictability erodes the human need for what researchers call personal control, the sense that actions lead to predictable outcomes. When that sense collapses, people seek it in smaller, more reliable domains. This is where the gear lever becomes something else entirely. A manual transmission is one of the few systems in modern life that responds to the human body with perfect honesty. Press the clutch too quickly, the car stalls. Find the friction point correctly, the car moves. There is no algorithmic mediation. There is no buffering. The feedback is immediate, physical, and entirely proportional to the skill applied. For a generation navigating a world where effort and outcome had become dangerously decoupled, that directness was not a feature, it was a relief. Psychologists who study intrinsic motivation describe a concept called competence satisfaction, the deep pleasure that comes not from reward but from the pure experience of doing something well. Manual transmission driving delivers this in concentrated form. Every smooth upshift is a small confirmation that the driver exists, acts, and produces a result. That might sound like an overstatement. It is not. When external systems feel unresponsive, humans intensify their relationship with systems that are not. But there is something the popular narrative about millennial nostalgia consistently gets wrong. Most commentators describe manual transmission obsession as a longing for simplicity, a retreat from complexity, a generational preference for analog over digital. This framing is flattering but incorrect. Millennials are not drawn to the manual gearbox because it is simple. They are drawn to it because it is demanding. The friction is the point. The possibility of stalling, of grinding a gear, of getting it wrong in a way that is immediately audible, this is not a flaw that enthusiasts tolerate. It is the reason they keep coming back. Research on optimal experience, most extensively developed by psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, identifies a specific mental state that emerges when a task's difficulty precisely matches a person's skill level. In that state, self-consciousness disappears, time distorts, the mind becomes fully occupied and paradoxically at rest. Driving a manual transmission on a winding road, in traffic, on a mountain pass, produces this state with unusual reliability. The car does not allow the driver's attention to drift. The cost of distraction is mechanical and immediate. That enforced presence is not a side effect. For many people, it is the entire point. Films understood this before psychologists named it. The 1976 film Taxi Driver placed a deeply dissociated man behind the wheel of a car for a reason. Drive, released in 2011, constructed its entire emotional architecture around a man who spoke almost nothing but communicated everything through the act of driving. In both films, the car is not a vehicle, it is a psychological state made visible. Millennials who grew up watching these films absorbed an association between driving as complete physical engagement and a particular kind of interior coherence, the feeling of being fully inhabited by oneself. Video games extended the mythology further. The Gran Turismo series launched in 1997 and introduced an entire generation to the tactile fantasy of performance driving. You could not touch the car, you could not smell the fuel or feel the seat, but the simulated gear changes, the engine sound climbing through the rev range, the sense of mastering a particular corner on a particular track, these created emotional memories attached to the idea of manual control. By the time those players were old enough to sit in a real cockpit, the neural associations were already formed. What nobody talks about is what the obsession costs. Manual transmission driving in modern urban environments is genuinely inconvenient. Stop-and-go traffic in a manual car is fatiguing. Left knee fatigue is real. Finding a new car with 3 pedals requires active searching because fewer than 2% of vehicles sold in the United States now come with a manual option. The enthusiast does not simply prefer this configuration, they seek it out, pay a premium for it, maintain older vehicles to access it, and will describe the inconvenience with something that sounds like pride. That is not irrationality, that is identity formation under constraint. When a behavior becomes difficult to maintain and a person maintains it anyway, it stops being a preference. It becomes a signal, first to others, then more importantly to themselves. The manual transmission driver is communicating something about what kind of attention they bring to their life. They have chosen the version of the task that requires more of them. In a cultural moment saturated with convenience, optimization, and frictionless experience, the deliberate selection of difficulty is a philosophical statement. Most people who make it could not fully articulate it, but they feel its truth every time they downshift into a corner. The broader pattern here is not unique to cars. It appears in the return to vinyl records, despite the objective audio limitations. It appears in the revival of film photography among people who own perfectly capable digital cameras. It appears in the resurgence of manual espresso machines, mechanical watches, and handwritten correspondence. In each case, the technology offers less efficiency and more engagement. The generation that grew up being told that efficiency was the highest value quietly began to question whether efficiency was the right metric for a human life. Manual transmission is simply where that question gets asked at highway speed. Here is the realization that changes everything. The person sitting in that parking lot practicing clutch engagement with nowhere to go is not obsessed with the transmission. They are practicing the act of being the cause of something. In a world that increasingly processes people as variables in systems they cannot see or influence, they found a machine that does not move unless they move it, does not respond unless they respond first, and cannot be automated away from them. The obsession was never about driving. It was about the radical, unfashionable insistence on being the one who decides. The car is just the only place left where that still feels completely true.